staying on this topic with my guests here, Mr. Rong and Professor John Ngong. Gentlemen, the president has arrived in Vietnam. Let's start with Mr. Rong here in the studio. It is the Chinese president's first trip to Vietnam in 6 years. The last time he visited was in 2017. What can we expect from his visit this time, Mr. Rong?
Yeah, it is true. I think this is the first visit by President Xi in 6 years' time. But it's also the third visit for President Xi. And if we include the visit when President Xi was the vice president, I think it's the fourth visit. So definitely, there are very high expectations that this is a very important visit. It's a visit of critical importance that will, through the joint efforts of the two sides, and it would not only bring the relationship to a new high, but more importantly, I think the two sides would work together to set the new direction and formulate the new blueprints, but more importantly, I explore new areas to strengthen, to deepen, to substantiate this special relationship, to bring in more benefits, not only to the two peoples of the two countries, but also for the region and the world as a whole, as we are now, need more certainty, more stability.
A lot of new things to find out, and we look forward to finding them out with you, Mr. Rong. Thank you so much. And again, just to remind our viewers that General Secretary of the Communist Party of China Central Committee and Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Vietnam for that state visit. CGTN reporter Dong Xue is now live at the Noi Ba International Airport in Hanoi. Dong Xue, tell us what you can see and what is the atmosphere where you are.
Sure, Zhongshi, I think you might as well can feel the vibe right now. Chinese President Xi Jinping is about to touch down in Hanoi to begin his state visit to Vietnam. And around me are reporters, journalists, and business and students representatives among the welcoming committee at the airport. Well, this two-day visit marks President Xi's first time in Vietnam in 6 years, making it particularly special due to the strong and close relations between the two countries. Well, it has been 15 years since the two sides established their comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership, reflecting Vietnam's high regard for diplomatic ties. And at the airport, as you can see behind me, all these Vietnamese officials are here, and among them, Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh will be here to welcome President Xi and his wife, Madam Pheng Liyuan. Well, during this visit, President Xi aims to solidify ties with his Vietnamese counterparts in politics, the economy, regional cooperation. And the agenda is packed as well, covering bilateral relations, trade, maritime issues, and both sides are expected to elevate diplomatic relations to a higher degree. And as you can see, the plane carries President Xi Jinping and his wife, Madam Pheng Liyuan, and the Chinese delegations is touching down right now. Is touching down right now. So we will be seeing them stepping out of the airplane very soon.
Yeah, let's keep
While we're waiting for them, in the following day, President Xi is expected to meet with Vietnam's General Secretary Ron Phu Trong, Vietnamese President Vu Pham Nhuon, the Prime Minister, as well as the Congressional Chairman Zhong Shi.
Yeah, Dong Xue, I was just saying, let's keep the pictures here at the airport just a little bit longer because the plane carrying the Chinese president has touched down. It is now taxiing on the airport. He has a very tight schedule this time, just 2 days in Vietnam, really a whirlwind, where he will be meeting with top leaders, including the General Secretary of Vietnam's Communist Party Central Committee. As Dong Xue mentioned just now, the President and Prime Minister of Vietnam. We will bring you more details as they become available. And certainly now let's talk about this with my guests here. Mr. Rong is now with me in the studio, and Professor John Ngong joins me via Skype. Professor, we were talking about this relationship and how trade has really contributed to this relationship. And how do you think trade and economic affairs rank on the list of topics for both leaders this time? Because we understand they'll be talking about politics, security, practical cooperation, 6 topics in total. How important are the topics of trade and economic affairs this time? Professor Gong?
I think ultimately, oh, sorry.
Yes, Professor Gong, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so I think ultimately the two countries' relationship today is really built on the close economic relationship. I think we all know that the United States, in its competition with China, is trying to fold Vietnam under its wing to essentially form a sort of a quasi-alliance in this region, the Asia-Pacific region, to contain China. And certainly from Beijing's perspective, it wants to, break out this containment and develop a better relationship with Vietnam. And I think on the economic side, it's really important balance. And I think there are indeed, it's many economic benefits accruing to both sides, especially in the context of Vietnam's rapidly being industrialized, Vietnam receiving a lot of foreign direct investment, and the trade between China and Vietnam is just booming. I think certainly trade and business ties would be on the agenda between the two sides during the talk. And I think probably they're going to talk about some important projects. Typically at a level like this. Landmark projects, for example, big railway projects, port projects. They probably would like to talk about firming up these projects, that's what I think that probably will be on the agenda between the two sides from an economic point of view.
And gentlemen, hold on just 1 second. For viewers that are just joining us on CGTN, you're looking at live pictures coming out of the international airport in Hanoi, Vietnam, where visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping has just touched down to begin a state visit to Vietnam. This year marks the 15th anniversary of China-Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Cooperative Partnership. And according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, during the visit, General Secretary Xi Jinping will hold talks respectively with General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam Central Committee, Nguyen Phu Truong, and State President Vo Van Thuan, and meet with Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh of Vietnam and also Chairman of the National Assembly, Von Dinh Hue. You've been hearing me and my guests talk about the possible topics that can come up in their conversations this time. The two sides likely will discuss upgrading the China-Vietnam relations and focus on 6 major areas, including politics, security, practical cooperation, public support, multilateral affairs, and maritime issues, and work to deepen and substantiate the comprehensive strategic cooperation between the two countries. And Mr. Rong, that brings me to my next question. This comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership, which both sides are so proud of because they've had it for 15 years, that is actually the highest level of diplomatic relations that Vietnam can have with a foreign country. And what does that signify? How has this label, if you will, contributed to the development of bilateral ties? Because obviously you can't just slap this label on just about any bilateral relationship. How have the relations really flourished under this cooperative partnership?
Yeah, I think try to recall that 15 years ago when China and Vietnam agreed to upgrade to the relation to such a level. I think certainly it is based on the progress and achievements that has been made before. But more importantly, as I look back in retrospect, that the past 15 years have seen the fastest growth and the development of the relationship, not only I think in terms of the relation, but more importantly in terms of the contribution, the role that is contributing their respective development. China 15 years ago, I think we just hosted the Olympic Games, and it was on the critical stage where China's economic and social development is developing very fast. I mean, Vietnam, to some extent, is also very much along this line. And as we look back in the past 15 years, I think politically, as we have seen that the trust has been growing and steadily. And economically, we're talking about the practical cooperation. We have seen, of course, that in terms of trade and investment, again, developing so fast that contributing the two sides' development. And also, I think people-to-people interactions, if we're talking about on that, there are big achievements along this line. And the question of differences or disputes, again, it is not easy because I think the relationship, these disputes, these issues that touch upon key issues, sovereignty, territorial integrity, maritime disputes, so on and so forth. But thanks to the joint efforts of the two sides, these issues are properly managed and they are put to the right, proper place. So with the advantage of that retrospect, I think we can very much sure and confident that the next 15 years and more will continue to enjoy steady and healthy development. But more importantly, I think, as we all agree, that the two top leaders are working very closely with the support of all across of the life of the society to bring the relationship to a new high, so that they will continue to contribute their respective development, but more importantly for the region and the world as a whole.
Professor Gong, China is many things to Vietnam. You said just now that Vietnam reminds you of China back in the 1990s, where things were happening really fast and infrastructure was being built to really usher in a golden era of development. China is also Vietnam's source of components and industrial raw material. Where Vietnam can import these things from China and develop an intermediate goods manufacturing economy. China and Vietnam, in a way, really constitute a supply and industrial chain, if you will. But more than anything, China is an important market for Vietnam, especially if you look at the agricultural products, fruits, vegetables, aquatic products for Vietnamese exports. How important is China as a market for Vietnam?
This is absolutely important. You look at the trade between China and Vietnam. We have been exporting a lot of manufacturers, intermediate products into Vietnam. But trade has to be balanced more or less. I think Vietnam is able to catch up with the ramp up of exports from China by exporting its own products, as you mentioned, agricultural products, fruits, for example. I think it's my experience. I don't know about you. It's my experience that in the last few years we've seen a lot more sort of exotic, tropical fruits on markets in many cities in China, and they're amazing thing, and they're quite affordable. So I think. Definitely, Vietnam is one source country that have been providing these, great fruits, wonderful fruits to the Chinese market. And you look at the statistics, agricultural products from Vietnam exports to China has been growing rapidly. And thanks a lot to the infrastructure that's currently being put in place, shipment by railway, shipment on the sea. So I think, this is a very beneficial relationship for the two sides. But I still want to say that China's market, from Vietnam's perspective, is more than just about agricultural products and fruits and vegetables. It could be other things. It could be manufactured products as well. I would bet that in the future we're going to see more and more manufacturing products made in Vietnam that are getting popular here in China. Because after all, the companies making these products, they used to make them in China. Whether they be American companies, European companies, or Chinese companies, it's just that the fundamental economic force at work, the labor costs in China rising up, and these manufacturing industries are more migrating to Vietnam, and ultimately there's a demand for that in the Chinese market as well. So I would imagine that the kind of relationship between Vietnam and China is going to further increase in terms of trade volume. And I think quite likely, maybe Vietnam will overtake South Korea and Japan to be China's second or third largest trading partner.
Professor, this is such an interesting topic. Can I stay with you on this topic just a little bit longer, because Vietnam has established itself as a major manufacturing hub in the region, that's for sure. As you mentioned, a lot of things that used to be made in China are now being made in Vietnam thanks to cheaper labor, thanks to industrial upgrading that has happened in China. But what does that make of the relations between China and Vietnam? Does it make China, in a way, resentful towards Vietnam because it's got more of the manufacturing now, or because China is benefiting from an upgraded industrial chain here, that China doesn't mind having many of these manufacturing now take place in Vietnam? Just help us understand that this codependence that is obviously benefiting two sides, that is likely to last, that is likely to continue to happen, Professor.
It doesn't have to be an antagonistic relationship. I think it's the fundamental economics of work. It's very natural that for countries engaged in free trade, I'm talking about free trade, that factor prices would tend to be equalized in a sense that equalized with the developed countries. When we talk about factor price, salary, wage certainly is a factor price, and we're seeing that's exactly happening here in China. The wage level in China is rapidly catching up with, say, the wage level in South Korea, in Japan, and as a result of that, it's very natural that the low-end, labor-intensive manufacturing industries will be looking for something else, somewhere else. So I think Vietnam is actually a good destination. It's just south of the border, the culture is very similar to China's. Transportation-wise, it's very close. So I think between China and Vietnam, the two countries are rapidly building together, forming, being part of the Northeast Asia, East Asia supply chain network. As part of the global supply chain network. And this model has been working very well for the last 30 to 40 years here in China, and I think the benefits are now starting to be extending into Vietnam as well. I would also add that from Vietnam's perspective, participation in a global value chain production model has been it's been winning, it's proven winning formula. This is how China is developed. And I think the relationship between Vietnam and China, to make probably an inappropriate analogy here, is somewhat like United States and Mexico, right? American companies, they set up a lot of operations along the border in the Mexico area, in areas south of the border, in Laredo, in Tijuana, a lot of south of El Paso in Texas. Many manufacturing companies have set up their operations over there. And I think what's happening in Vietnam is somewhat very similar in my view. We're starting to see some industries migrating there, but I think ultimately we don't have to care too much about
Professor, let me jump in right now. Hold that thought. It's such an interesting topic. I wish to talk to you later about it. But now we're seeing the Chinese president and his wife stepping out of the plane. The plane landed in Hanoi, Vietnam moments ago. The Chinese president is now starting his official visit to Vietnam. He will be in Vietnam for 2 days. It's a whirlwind packed schedule. He will be meeting with top Vietnamese leaders, including the General Secretary of Vietnam's Communist Party Central Committee, Vietnam's President and Prime Minister, and of course, the Chairman of the National Assembly. There is a lot of things to do and not a lot of time. 2 days of time in Vietnam, and a brief welcome ceremony is being held in his honor right there at the international airport in Hanoi. Our reporter Dong Xue mentioned top Vietnamese leaders greeting and meeting the visiting Chinese president there at the airport. The last time the Chinese president visited Vietnam was 6 years ago. So a lot of anticipation on his visit this time, especially on how China and Vietnam plan to elevate their ties to an even newer, a new and higher level here, because they've had that comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership for 15 long years, and both sides have talked about elevating that to a new high. We're very curious and excited to learn about what that new high means for both sides. We do understand the two sides will be talking about 6 areas primarily. They are politics, security, practical cooperation, public support, multilateral affairs, and maritime issues, and they will work to deepen and substantiate that comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership between them. And ahead of his visit, Vietnam's Nan Dan newspaper published a signed article by President Xi. In the article, Xi said the two sides have conducted exchanges with mutual trust, enhanced common interests with mutual beneficial cooperation, grown closer through friendly exchanges, and treated each other with sincerity. He said China hopes the two nations will promote the building of a community with a shared future that carries strategic significance. To build a China-Vietnam community with a shared future, President Xi said the two sides need to maintain strategic communication and the good use of their complementary strengths. We've been talking to both my guests here about what that means from each side to contribute to a healthier, stronger, more vibrant relationship. The two countries should step up friendly exchanges and properly manage differences and expand consensus. I do want to also bring our viewers up to speed about the trade relations between China and Vietnam, because as my guest Professor Gong was talking about just now, the trade ties definitely constitute a big part of their bilateral relations and are a strong reason why bilateral ties have been developing steadily, healthily, strongly for the past couple of years. In terms of bilateral trade, you're hearing the crowds there chanting, "Welcome, welcome, welcome" to the visiting Chinese president. He's been received by a lot of enthusiasm, obviously, there at the airport. The Chinese president waving to the crowds. Walking beside him is his wife, Madam Peng Liyuan. A lot of excitement and enthusiasm there at the airport as we continue to hear chants of welcome towards the visiting Chinese president. And in terms of that bilateral cooperation, we understand bilateral trade came in at nearly $235 billion in 2022, up 2.1% on a yearly basis. It is the second consecutive year that bilateral trade surpassed $200 billion. And cooperation in green development and digital economy are new points of growth between the two countries. Projects like the Hanoi Metro Line 2 and Vietnam's large waste-to-energy plant were both built by Chinese companies and have greatly benefited the lives of local people. The two countries have also jointly promoted the implementation of RCEP and the construction of the China-ASEAN Free Trade Zone 3.0. If you're just joining us here on CGTN, a red carpet welcome ceremony being held in the honor of the visiting Chinese president. He and his wife have just stepped out of the plane. They're ready to begin that state visit to Vietnam at the invitation of Vietnamese leaders. It will last 2 days, both Tuesday and Wednesday. They have a lot to talk about, mainly focusing on how to elevate the ties between the two here. And we see the motorcade is getting ready to move. Of course, CGTN will have comprehensive coverage of the Chinese president's agenda and trip in Vietnam. So make sure you do stay with us right here on CGTN. All right, gentlemen, let's continue with our discussions on the president's trip to Vietnam. Can I have you talk a little bit about the importance of the Chinese market to Vietnam also?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Rong.
Yes, sure. I think Professor Dong very much talked a lot about the potentialities and prospect of China and Vietnam trade relationship, about the importance of China, the market, and also I think the importance of Vietnam. I mean, I think the fast growing emerging economy, a close neighbor. I mean, such a special relationship. And so this relationship, I mean, is going to be very much focused on, based on mutually beneficial cooperation and its huge potential in terms of the development. And remember, I think as every Chinese, when you look at the Vietnam, look at the development of Vietnam and the relationship, one naturally would have that kind of a feeling, like dévoué, that is, say, what Vietnam is happening.
Mr. Rowe, we're looking at live pictures of the streets in Hanoi.
Right.
A lot of people gathered to welcome the visiting Chinese president, holding flags from both countries. Of course, at the airport, we heard a lot of chants of welcoming Mandarin for the visiting Chinese president. And here you see lining up the streets in Hanoi, people holding national flags and also chanting welcome, a warm welcome to the visiting Chinese president also. I'm sorry to have interrupted you, Mr. Rong. Please continue.
No, that's a great story. I mean, if you even look at the crowds, the people that are greeting President Xi, one would naturally notice about the color of flag, the red flag, right? The only difference is that we have the Chinese national flag have 5 stars, while the Vietnamese one they have just big star. But there are a lot of similarities. I mean, also in terms of certainly we talked about the trade, about development. But I would bring back to the question of political dimension. I think both China and Vietnam are striving very hard for building socialism with its respective characteristics. And in this regard, there are again very much, quite a lot China and Vietnam can learn from each other, can share experience and I think lessons, if I can say. And interestingly, I think those who follow the development in Vietnam, one would be shocked if we talk with these academics, officials, how familiar, how sort of well they know about China in terms of these thinkings, ideas, how to govern the party, how to pursue their developments. So that is also a very much an area where China and Vietnam can the advantages where the two countries can work together, can certainly give full play. And that's why I think gives the confidence and the expected and anticipation that China and Vietnam and the relationship will continue to enjoy a steady and profound development.
Yeah, as you say, Mr. Rong, both countries have a lot of similarities, which lay a good foundation for the friendly exchanges of the people. So I do want to ask both you and Professor Gong here about the dimension of people-to-people exchanges. We've seen a lot of friendly sentiments toward the visiting of the Chinese president. And here are some data I would like to bring to your attention, to the attention of our viewers. In the first 10 months of this year, Vietnam recorded more than 1.3 million Chinese passenger trips. And China and Vietnam have co-constructed a new cross-border tourism attraction, known as the De Tien Ban Gyok waterfall. It started trial operations in September. Professor Gong, I know you're extremely well traveled. Tell us, have you ever been to Vietnam? If yes, what have been your impressions?
Oh, well, unfortunately, I haven't actually. It's a little bit ashamed to say that. I'd love to visit one day. But I do want to make one point, though. I think the fact that the two countries' political systems are quite similar is very important. And I think that even though we have differences, we have disputes, but I think the relationship can be, very similar to the relationship between, for example, between the United States and Canada, which both countries have, basically the same political system, even though they have disputes and they have quarrels. They fight over the fishing rights of salmon, for example. They fight over the rights of exporting Canadian lumber to Canada, for example. But nevertheless, two countries manage their differences, and overall, I think they are a strategic alliance relationship. I don't see why the same thing cannot happen between China and Vietnam. We both have the same political system. Both have the same economic system, so-called socialist market economy. We also have differences, but I think the differences can be managed. And ultimately, I think it's the regional integration, it's the economic integration between the two sides. It's the very important markets for each other that are driving the bilateral relationship between the two countries. It's not just the Chinese market that's important to Vietnam. I also want to emphasize the importance of the Vietnamese market to China. And you look at some pictures of the streets in Vietnam, in Hanoi, in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. Just look at the number of motorcycles. I see a huge market for Chinese-made cars, special electric cars. I mean, why should Vietnamese stick with motorcycles? I mean, these are the things that belong to the 1990s, 2000s here in China. And now people are crawling into cars all over the place in China. Why cannot the same thing happening in Vietnam, right? So, we're talking about over 100 million potential, cars to be sold in the Vietnamese market. So, this is a huge, huge market from China's perspective. So anyway, I think, markets are important for both sides. Both are emerging markets, are growing very rapidly. It's a good thing that the two countries maintain a good relationship with each other and economic ties as well.
That's a great dimension. That's a great element mentioned by Professor Gong, because obviously you don't necessarily get to be on good terms just because you're neighbors, right? In the example of China and Vietnam, you see a lot of mutual efforts. It's very much a two-way street. Both countries obviously recognize each other's importance in their market, in their political influence, in regional integration, and they're moving towards each other. That's a great point. But I still want to try this with Mr. Rong. Have you been to Vietnam? And if there's anything you can share with us about your experience traveling with the country and the angle of people-to-people exchanges, how have that contributed to this relationship between the two?
Yeah, I've been several times.
Wonderful, excellent.
I'm very much impressed, as I said, that the potentiality, but the more important similarity, where I was standing on the street of Vietnam, Hanoi, and Ho Chi Minh City, I would just say, wow, that was something like 15 or 20 years, China. And that's why I think for Chinese, and I think for Vietnamese, either students or visitors, I think what they are seeing or experiencing in China will be that was the future of Vietnam. And more importantly, I think because of the close, because China and Vietnam are neighbors, and so culturally, historically, there are a lot of common grounds, and particularly in terms of culture. I think the Vietnamese, they read, they can read Chinese, and they sometimes they have the particular older generations, they write Chinese, and they are very much familiar with the Chinese stories, the 4 classical novels, and also, of course, the contemporary Chinese movies, TV series, songs, and so very much close because of that. And of course, that is not enough, because the younger generations are exposed to more and more diverse culture. So efforts need to be made to ensure the relationship, people-to-people relationship, particularly cultural exchange, will continue. And that's why I think people-to-people exchanges, P2P, is one of the 6 priority areas of this visit.
It's so interesting, gentlemen, both of you mentioning that Vietnam resembles China a couple decades back. Mr. Yong, you study political science and political systems, and you have mentioned that both countries enjoy similarities in their political systems. Do you think that similarity, that resemblance, is a reminder for Vietnam that China could be a great success model? And when they look at this model from China, what are they primarily looking at as valuable lessons? Why China has pulled off economically? What do you think Vietnam at this point wants to learn from China? Is it simply copy and paste? How does Vietnam want lessons from China, but those lessons to suit the conditions that are unique to Vietnam?
Well,
Mr.
I
Rong.
think, yes, that's a great question again. I think for Vietnamese, they would be very much to learn or to see how they can learn from China's experience in terms of how to explore a road for development with its own characteristics. I mean, or socialism with Vietnamese characteristics, and to pursue that road independently. And in a self-reliant way. This is also very much important, and also I think one of the most important experience so far. That is not easy in the context where I think major country relationship rivalry has been going, and also Vietnam, as it's undergoing development and transformation, it also have to very much, to manage the challenges arising from that in terms of social, economic development, and also the stability, and how to ensure that all walks of life would benefit from development. And there are, again, that's why I think in this the visit, the 2 parties, the 2 governments, and at various levels, they are going to continue the process. That cooperation in terms of how they can learn from. But to remember, the most important thing is that the Vietnamese would like to do their own way in light that suits its own conditions. So it's not a photocopy. It's not just blindly copy Chinese experience. Rather, to draw experience, learn, inspiration from China's success, and also to make sure that their road of development that suits its own conditions, and also, of course, meets the needs and demands of its people.
Great insight from Mr. Rong here. Professor Gong, can I bring you into this topic also? When Vietnam looks at China, what is applicable for Vietnam? What exactly will Vietnam learn from the China model, the China experience?
Well, I think the core essence of the China model goes back to what Mr. Deng Xiaoping did about 40 years ago. That is reform and opening up. And I think this is exactly how China succeeded. And I think the Vietnamese know this very well, that reform and open door policy is really the success recipe here. And they've been doing this, and they've been doing this at a tremendous work. And I think if you look at the Vietnamese ruling party, the Communist Party in Vietnam, they have undergone a lot of reforms in this past few decades. Really transformed itself from a sort of a very dogmatic communist oriented party to a more realistic and also a party that focused on economic development, focused on raising people's living standard. More towards that direction. I think they've done a very successful job. And on the opening up, in some sense, in my view, in certain areas, I think even Vietnamese are going one step ahead of China in some areas in terms of opening up. They really went out of their way to attract foreign direct investment, make their own markets accessible to foreign companies, of course, including Chinese companies as well. So I think it's really going down that path, the path set out by Mr. Deng Xiaoping about 40 years ago, that has made China successful. That's also making right now Vietnam successful as well. And there's no doubt about that the future of those two countries are around that path, path towards home, towards more reform within.
Professor Gong, I think your audio is breaking up a little bit. Let's see if we can fix that. But in the meantime, let's also talk about the struggle for Vietnam. Mr. Rong, something else you said really struck a chord with me, because you mentioned independence, you mentioned self-reliance. Obviously, Vietnam wants to find its own path of development that suits its own conditions, but it's also very aware that it wants to be as independent as possible, as self-reliant as possible when it comes to major power relations. There's almost a sense that Vietnam doesn't want to, bother getting caught up in the conflict between major powers. It has this focus on economic development that it wants to waste no time with. So, in terms of relations with China and the United States, how delicate is that balance Vietnam is trying to find here? And how do you think Vietnam has been doing, sort of balancing itself between these two major powers?
Yeah, I think so far Vietnamese are doing a great job in terms of how to develop their relationship with China on the one hand and the United States on the other, without, linking them in a way that the other side, the one of the relationship will be either affected or, being affected at the other side. And having said that, of course, it's a difficult job. It will call a lot of diplomatic skills. But the most important thing, I think, Vietnam has very much highlighted and repeatedly talked even to publicly and privately to the Chinese side, that it attached great importance, top priorities of the relationship. And in the meantime, of course, out of the needs to diversify its relationship with others, and also, I think, in terms of multilateralization, as they say, to pursue its own independence and self-reliance, it needed to develop a relationship with other countries in the world, including the United States, Japan, and others. I think as far as China is concerned, we don't have any problem. As long as these relationships does not affect or does not developed at expenses of China's, and to which I think we are confident. And of course, I think as China and its relationship with the United States is also stabilizing in the wake of the San Francisco meeting. And the Vietnamese diplomacy will also continue to sort of adapt to that changes. All in all, I think we are living in a multi-polar world where I think all the country, each country has a right and would also do whatever it means to pursue its own interest. And I think China very much are ready to work with all the countries in the world, and Vietnam, the United States, to ensure the world will continue to enjoy stability, peace, and the prosperity that has been enjoyed in over the decades.
Mr. Rong, when the rest of the world sees China and Vietnam celebrate 15 years of comprehensive strategic cooperation, they have also taken notice of Vietnam and the U.S. elevating their ties to a similar standing, to a similar status just a couple months ago. Can you help us understand the background here of that upgrade in Vietnam-U.S. relations, and what did Washington want with this upgrade in relations with Vietnam? Washington has also said it wants to increase investment towards Vietnam. What are Washington's calculations and considerations here?
I think it is true. I think back in September, when President Biden visited Vietnam, the relationship between Vietnam and the United States has been also elevated to a comprehensive strategic sort of partnership based on the comprehensive partnership 10 years ago. So there again, this is an important sort of year for the bilateral relationship. Having said that, I think from the viewpoint of Vietnam, the United States is also an important country, and it has a very difficult past. And with the joint efforts, I think the two sides has normalized the relationship and pursues a policy that is forward-looking. That's great. I think that's great. The problem, I think, as far as the region is concerned, is the United States. While understandably it emphasizes attach importance to Vietnam, an emerging economy, an important regional economy. It looks like it's pursue its own agenda. It's agenda that is being, in the end, that is aimed at suppressing or containing China. This is something I think China does not want to see, and this is something Vietnamese does not want. That's why it has repeatedly said that it pursue an independent policy. It wants to pursue its relationship with all the countries based on equality and mutual benefit, and does not want to be any party or part of the campaign or camp that against China. This is something I think what we are going to see. And the United States will, in the end, understand that Vietnam is an independent country. Vietnam pursues an independent foreign policy that suits its own condition. So it is impossible or it does not serve the interests or overall interest of the relationship if they want to force Vietnam to take side, and not to mention to join the camp against China.
Professor Gong, we were talking about the wider context against which the state visit is happening while the world watches China and Vietnam celebrate 15 years of comprehensive strategic cooperation. They have also, for sure, taken notice of the United States and Vietnam elevate their ties to a similar standing, to a similar status back in September. Do you feel that Vietnam is still caught up in the conflict between China and the U.S.? Does Vietnam have to find its own balance between these two powers?
Well, first of all, China and the United States are not in a conflict yet, I guess. It's just in a competition. But, from a Vietnamese perspective, I think it's all understandable that any country in that kind of a situation would like to be striking a balance between the two sides in order to maximize its own national interests. That's not surprising, and I think it's also quite understandable from China's perspective. Nevertheless, I think there's one red line that Vietnam has to be very careful not to cross over, and that is with respect to the security area. What the United States has been trying to doing here in the Asia-Pacific region is to try to establish something very similar to NATO in Europe, or at least a quasi kind of a NATO in Europe, or sometimes people call it a little NATO here in the Asia-Pacific region. And this is very dangerous, especially for a country that's directly neighboring China. I mean, history and past proceedings have repeatedly shown that for a country to be siding with another alliance against a very large, very powerful neighbor country, that's not something that any country would be interested in getting into. I mean, history has repeatedly proven that. And I think, the Vietnamese side should quite understand very well that, we are neighbors. We're going to be together with neighbors for decades, for centuries, for hundreds of thousands of years ahead. And America, come and go. They're on the other side of the Pacific, right? Right now they are trying to establish some kind of a quasi alliance here along the sea and on land. But ultimately, they are thousands of miles away. So I think it's always a good idea for neighboring countries to set aside their differences, settle their differences, and move forward with a friendly relationship, to be good neighbors with each other. And I think this neighborhood keeps expanding and expanding, especially in the context of the RCEP, and also in the context of Asia, particularly East Asia, Northeast Asia, rising both geopolitically as well as geoeconomically on a global scale. I think the epicenter of the world is coming to that state, coming to this area, and both countries are countries with a deep, long history. We're all both proud people, and we all work very hard, and we can cooperate very hard as well. So I think there's no reason that can stand between us, between Vietnam and China, to develop a much more constructive and beneficial relationship between the two sides into the future.
It does look like for now that is the direction where both countries wish to take. Mr. Rong, China has proposed the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative, which aim to contribute to global stability and development. How do you look at their significance in the region, and how does Vietnam really fit into this general picture, this general vision that China has envisions for world peace and development?
Yeah, I think Vietnam has, again, very much responded in a positive way to these initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. And the foreign minister made it very clear during his meeting with Foreign Minister Wang Yi that these initiatives are in line with the principles and purposes of UN Charter, and contributes to the peace and stability of the region and the world, and Vietnam support that. And as a matter of fact, I think Vietnam joins the the friends of the Global Development Initiative, and I think we are anticipating that during this visit, Vietnamese, they will also come up even more forcefully or positively in terms of how Vietnam can work together to promote, to implement these initiatives, which I think is regarded as pathways to implementing the visionary ideas of building community of a shared future. So Vietnam is an important country. China has an initiative, and Vietnam and China working together and implementing, following these initiative, putting these into practice will definitely have great contribution for peace, development, and prosperity of the region.
Professor Gong, can I ask the same question to you in regard to the Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative? Where does Vietnam fit into this? I mean, you said security will be a touchy topic, it will be a sensitive topic, but as we understand, it will come up in the talks between Chinese and Vietnamese leaders this time. They will also talk about the South China Sea issue. Both sides have moved forward their relations on the back of certain frictions regarding these issues. It's likely that they will still work over those differences and continue to grow their relations. But how will these issues impact their relationship?
Yeah, well, first let's talk about the issue in the South China Sea. I think let's acknowledge that we have disputes of some territorial rights over some atolls or islands, whatever you call it. But I think we need to set aside this, and I think both sides are engaged in bilateral negotiations about a code of conduct when it comes to matters like this. And I think this is a very important principle, is that this is a regional issue, this is a bilateral issue, and we have to resolve these issues in a bilateral manner. And I think both China and Vietnam are moving towards that direction. So I think this is good news to hear. And more broadly, I think the issue about Vietnam and China maintaining peace and
All right,
prosperity.
Professor, I'm going to have to interrupt you right there. We're looking at more live pictures coming in from Hanoi, where we believe the motorcade is pulling in closer to the hotel. About 30 minutes ago, the Chinese president arrived in Hanoi, Vietnam, starting his state visit there. We're just keeping close tabs on his movement in Hanoi. We understand the motorcade is getting close to the hotel. We will be bringing our viewers live pictures when that become available. I'm sorry to have cut you off, Professor. Please do continue.
Yeah, so I was about to say that the relationship between China and Vietnam can really set a good example for other neighboring countries of China. China is unique in the sense that it has probably the largest number of countries, bordering countries, as its neighbors. And I think the relationship between China and Vietnam can potentially set an example in terms of how much Vietnam can benefit, and also how much more economically developed Vietnam can be when it furthers and deepens its relationship with China. I mean, look at the number of countries surrounding China. Many of these countries are still quite poor, are not very much developed, and for countries like Laos, for example, Myanmar, for example, other countries bordering on the west, and Vietnam could set a very good example. We can have very good peaceful relationship at the same time, economically greatly benefit from a closer relationship with China, economically deeply integrated with China. So I think in that sense, just the fact that China maintains good relationship with all of its neighbors, which probably has the largest number of neighboring countries among all countries, is directly a huge contribution to global peace and prosperity, especially in this area, in the Asia-Pacific region.
Gentlemen, I believe we have time for one more question, and we're going to leave that with Mr. Rong here. I think a key word mentioned by Professor Gong just now is a great example set by China and Vietnam in working over some of these differences. I mean, it's easy and it's okay really to have differences between two nations, but China and Vietnam really have made efforts to work over their differences to reach their development goals here. Mr. Rong, can I have your thoughts on how both sides have come together to really mitigate those differences and not let those differences get in the way of common development?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think for China and Vietnam, they are close neighbors, and they share a lot of historical and cultural sort of similarities. But being neighbors, we all know there tend to be differences. That's exactly the reason why China and Vietnam, despite the closeness, despite the special uniqueness, I think there are differences. Differences in terms certainly related to the territorial disputes, the land boundary issues, fortunately has resolved. The maritime issue, unfortunately, has yet to be resolved. But in retrospect, the past decades have seen that thanks to joint efforts of the two sides, these disputes have very well managed. In the meantime, the two sides are also working together to ensure the development of the relationship in other dimensions: economic, trade, culture, people-to-people relationship, and of course we are talking about party-to-party, high-level, exchanges, communications. Prepare the ground to the final settlement, and that suits that's acceptable to the two sides. That's exactly, I think, China is arguing for. And fortunately, and I think the Vietnamese are also thinking along this line. That's why I think China and the Vietnam relationship can play a very important role to demonstrate, to highlight that between neighbors, we can work together. We can work together to find a way to pursue common development, in the meantime manage our differences, to ensure that these differences will not get in the way to the steady overall relationship.
Gentlemen, can we conclude with great minds think alike? And I've been so lucky to have two such great minds on my show today. Mr. Rong, Professor Gong, we appreciate valuable insight and analysis from both of you. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you.
Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Communist Party of China Central Committee and Chinese President, has arrived at Noi Bai International Airport in Hanoi, Vietnam. And that is all we have on Global Watch today. We leave you with beautiful scenes from across Vietnam. I'm Zhong Shi in Beijing on behalf of the entire team. Thank you so much for your company.